Welcome to Norse Code, the number one podcast for your Minnesota Vikings. I'm your host, Dusty O'Connell. Joining me this week, as per usual, in-house analyst, Vikings blogger extraordinaire, media gadfly, and all-around useful human, Arif Hassan. How you doing, Arif?
I'm good. How are you, Dusty?
I'm all right, I would say. It's spring is coming, and so we've got the garden going, but spring is not here yet, and so we're constantly watching the weather. I actually just came from taking all the plants indoors due to impending snowstorm. So.
Oh, fair enough. I think it's spring in Minnesota. I think we had our last snowfall a couple days ago, so I think it means it's spring. It was the last snowfall of the spring.
Excellent. We have a guest from rather far away geographically, although all distances are approximately equal over Skype. Joining us this week from Pro Football Focus, Sam Monson. How you doing, Sam?
I'm good. How are you guys?
Doing pretty well. How's the weather? Are you so is it spring in Ireland as well? Am I like belying my gross, very American lack of geographic
the
knowledge?
Seasons in Ireland are all fairly much the same. It rains. It's not too cold. It's the same thing 4 months of the year.
So it's basically the same stereotypes I have of English weather.
Yeah, exactly. Same kind of thing, just a little bit further west and greener and, happier people. Or at least drunker people.
You're right. Happier people.
So happier, yeah. All right. We will get to the interview portion. We'll go back to our traditional overweening draft coverage in a moment. But in the meantime, Arif would like to write more about the draft. And also he has a near insatiable hunger for Hot Pockets. And so I would be... What, you don't?
No.
Oh. I mean, as a blogger, I assumed you did.
That's fair.
At any rate, whatever Arif needs your $3.50 for, he needs it, is the point. But seriously, mostly to write articles about the big board, such as it is. And, draft guides are not individually very expensive, but if you want to read literally every draft guide...
Yeah, I do a lot in terms of condensing a bunch of draft boards together and trying to tease out analyses from comparing the draft boards to each other, find the most polarizing prospect, come up with a consensus draft board that you can work off of on draft day. There's going to be a new edition of that draft board this year. It's actually going to be the Pro Football Focus draft guide stuff, and that's something that I haven't done before. And in order to preview it, we actually have, like we mentioned at the top of the show, a guest from Pro Football Focus. Isn't that right, Dusty?
That is absolutely correct. So check out our Patreon page at patreon.com/NorseCode or our PayPal link, paypal.me/NorseCode to contribute your support to the show and help us help you create better content. But as Arif teased, this week we've got Sam Monson of Pro Football Focus. And Sam, you've been kind of on a little bit of a media tour. You just... evaluated, well, depending on who you ask, either every or merely the top 36 cornerback prospects in the draft.
Yeah, so we've all been... The season finishes for the NFL and we get straight into draft stuff at PFF. And we're now grading college games as well. So we've got every single game of the FBS season graded and analyzed the same way we do the NFL stuff. So as soon as the NFL season finishes, we get straight into tape and trying to work out the draft. And we obviously have a starting point because we have all this grading, but before we start getting into it, none of us really has too much of a clue in terms of the consensus big board out there, where everybody else has these guys going. So we have to kind of start from scratch, and you get a consensus big board going and the kind of PFF grading big board going, and then we see where the differences are and the guys we need to look at and the guys we need to start evaluating and have another look through the tape and work out why we're higher on them than other people and why other people are higher on guys than we are, and if there's a reason to move guys around. So I did a lot of cornerbacks. That was the first position I got into, and got pretty deep into the corners, looked at a whole bunch of guys that the NFL loves. The top guys, I think, are pretty much the same. Our guys, the top consensus guys, top 4 or 5 players were guys that PFF graded well. Jalen Ramsey is basically the consensus top defensive back in this draft, whether you consider him a cornerback, a safety, whatever, some kind of hybrid between the two. He's pretty much universally accepted to be the top guy. Then you get into what I call the pure corners, the guys that don't have a sort of safety joke or question mark about them. So the guy I think that we have up next is William Jackson, the Houston corner, who graded exceptionally well at PFF last year. I think he was the second highest grade in the nation, had exceptional coverage stats, looked really good. You put on tape and there's very little to dislike about him. He does everything well. He's one of the few guys at the top of this draft from a corner point of view that ticks all the NFL's boxes in terms of height, weight, speed, size, all this kind of stuff, in a way that guys like Mackenzie Alexander and Vernon Hargreaves don't necessarily. Those are two shorter guys and guys that don't necessarily fit that profile. So Jackson, I think, is the next guy we have up. Then you have those two shorter guys in Hargreaves and Alexander. And then I think you've got one more guy that probably gets into the first round. And then there's a big gap, I think, a big drop-off. And that's Eli Apple from Ohio State. And I think once you get past that point, I think there's a huge drop-off in this corner class to the next group of guys.
So actually, I have a question about that. The fact that you brought up both Eli Apple and William Jackson is really interesting to me, because I think maybe one of the challenges for you guys when you're constructing this is that very often NFL scouts won't look for the best performing player, but will look for the player whose traits sort of best translate according to what they think into the NFL. And I know that your draft guide is not a list of the top graded players that you have that are draft eligible for the season, but it has to be. I think that probably the difference between Eli Apple, and I haven't watched a ton of college players, so I could be way wrong on this, but the difference between Eli Apple and William Jackson is that William Jackson's playing well right now in college in a lot of ways that definitively translate, whereas Eli Apple might be, in many ways, a bit of a projection based off of his athleticism. Maybe he's a little bit more inconsistent than someone like Jackson because of it. At what point do you, or what are the challenges, rather, in finding a player who is playing well that may not project well, like let's say, Vernon Hargreaves, or finding a player that is not playing well that may project well at the next level, like maybe say Eli Apple, or going back to previous years, someone like that really fast LSU corner, I already forgot his name, Jalen something. Did you find yourself having to deal with those challenges when looking at the NFL draft board versus yours?
I think a guy like Eli Apple, I think, is playing pretty well now. The difference between him and Jackson is, I think Jackson's playing a lot better right now. The other difference is, I think Jackson is more scheme diverse. Eli Apple is a man coverage corner right now and not a great zone guy. And I think there's flaws at his game that aren't there in Jackson's necessarily. So I think there's ways of separating those two before you get into how well each guy is grading. It's interesting. We tend to start from the idea that a guy who has good college production is going to have good NFL production, as long as you're looking at the right stuff. And you think about that, it sounds crazy because all of us know of great college players that have just not been able to get it done at the NFL level. But I think what we look at is that because we're not looking at just touchdowns or interceptions or sacks or really raw, crude numbers that try and measure performance, because we're actually looking at play-by-play grading of these guys, it's looking at a much more detailed and sophisticated picture of his actual college production. And I think as long as you're looking at that kind of stuff, I think more often than not, a guy who produces really well at the college level is still going to produce at the NFL level. The majority of what we do with the tape study stuff after the NFL season is we start looking at these guys that have really high grades, and you say, okay, why can't this guy produce at the next level? Is there anything on tape that I'm looking at that is a reason this guy cannot succeed against higher competition? And a lot of the times you look at it and you say, there really isn't anything there. There's some guys you can see why you wouldn't like him. There's guys that are shorter than ideal profile, or guys that don't have necessarily the speed, or there's going to be plays here and there that catches them out. But a lot of these guys, you look at it and say, there really isn't anything in this guy's tape that should stop you from taking him high because he doesn't have, all the measurables. And one of the big things last year was the Leonard Williams versus Henry Anderson thing. And Leonard Williams was the consensus top 5 guy. Everybody had him going at the sharp end of the draft. And Henry Anderson was this guy who everyone had as a mid-round pick, this afterthought from Stanford. But the grade said that Henry Anderson was every bit the player of Leonard Williams, and if anything, graded slightly better than him. And it's a shame that he got injured halfway through his rookie season, but for halfway through that season, he was playing every bit as well as Leonard Williams, and we were seeing these two guys kind of going head-to-head as rookies, and both performing really well. Whereas if you looked at the grading in the college grading last year, you would say that both these guys are legit prospects and should have a big impact, but only one of them had the pre-draft hype because he was the guy that looked the part.
Well, so the Leonard Williams stuff was interesting because PFF received, I don't know, a lot of flack, but definitely got a lot of attention for basically just saying Leonard Williams is not the top prospect in the NFL. And, I mean, the piece was basically, we still think he's like a first-round pick, but the separation between him and other players is smaller. And in fact, we think that there's a lot of better players, even some at the same position, that are better than him. Given sort of the reputation that Pro Football Focus has as being a bunch of stats nerds, basically, do you think that do you think that creates sort of unique pressure? Now, maybe not pressure, but like a unique response that people have towards the stuff that you do? Or do you think, if a draftnik with a similar amount of people following them saying the same thing would get just as much flack?
I just think generally it's the world we're in at the moment, that it's very difficult to present a nuanced take on a guy. You either love him or you hate him. There's no middle ground. So if the rest of the world out there loves a guy and you're saying, well, maybe he's not that good, there's no way of doing that without the immediate response being, you hate this guy, you're crazy. The grading liked Leonard Williams. Leonard Williams graded really well last year for us. He was an impressive player. He was always going to be extremely good against the run. And all we were saying is, his pass rushing grade is not amazing. And when you watch tape, he doesn't dominate as consistently as you would expect a guy with those physical traits to dominate. So maybe he's not the guy that should go number 1, number 2, number 3 overall. And while we're at it, there's this guy, Henry Anderson, that's grading better than he is. And why is nobody talking about him? But you can't do that without everybody saying, why do you guys hate Leonard Williams? It's tough. I think there's definitely part of it that anytime you say anything negative about somebody's favorite player, it's very rare you get into a sensible, rational discussion with that person. It just becomes, dismissive and argumentative and hate, if you like, coming in the other direction.
Yeah, fair enough. No, that makes a lot of sense. I think that we've seen that. Yeah, I think you're right. We've seen that basically everywhere when, people try to say, this player isn't as people expect for whatever, for positive or negative. Even a player that's like negatively perceived, if you say positive things about them, people will jump on you. But one thing I found super interesting is actually, I think it's hilarious. It's become a joke to me. A lot of other people maybe take it a little more seriously. I don't really know why. But I think we've been talking a lot about cornerbacks. I think maybe the two most famous PFF cornerback takes from the previous draft are Gary Peters, and I don't even know what school he's from. And,
how do you not know what school Gary Peters is from? Do we not talk enough about Gary Peters for you to at least get a school right? Clemson.
No. I've committed all of my Gary Peters memory to making sure to remember he has 2 R's in his first name.
That was tough. Well, the way to get around that is to just call him Grabby.
Well, okay, yeah. So that's actually one interesting thing about the Gary Peters thing. So when I ask people at PFF about Gary Peters, it's just Steve, right? There's no one else at PFF that was as high on Gary Peters as Steve Palazzolo was, right?
Steve definitely started the Gary Peters thing. So Gary Peters graded really well at PFF. And like I said, the first thing we do is we start going through the tape and you ask yourself, why would this guy not be as successful at the next level? And so I started again. I was on corners last year. and I started going through Gary Peters' tape. And after a while of watching this, I was like, this guy is grabby at an unbelievable level. Like, so we have a guy on staff now called Bobby Slowick, who's a former NFL coach, son of a coach as well. And Bobby said something to me this year, which I thought was interesting. When he's watching corners, because in the college there's different rules, and not only is the officiating terrible, you think the NFL officiating is bad. When you start watching college games, it'll just make you tear your hair out. It's crazy. So you'll get away with a lot more, even if the rules aren't different. And then on top of that, the rules are different, so that there's no 5-yard chuck rule in college. If you're in front of him, you can put your hands on him and you can get physical with him. So that leads to a lot of heavy contact that in the NFL would be a penalty. So what you have to do, what Bobby looks at it by is, did he need to make the contact to be able to cover the guy? And so a guy like Eli Apple, for example, is pretty grabby. Mackenzie Alexander is pretty grabby as well. But those guys do it because they can rather than because they need to. Gary Peters, or Grabby Peters as I christened him after this film session, needed to grab. Like it was necessary for him to grab these guys nearly constantly. So, I still think that he was a better player than, undrafted and out of the league and all this kind of stuff. But the interesting thing is, I think definitely with corner, it's going to be very interesting because the NFL has a set profile of the kind of player they want to look for at cornerback. Mm-hmm. And PFF doesn't come at it with that. We come at it blind, and we just grade who played well, who did what on the field. So you're going to get guys that come up in this impartial blind system that the NFL is just not even interested in. And because it's such an opportunity-driven position, if the NFL doesn't like these guys, it's going to take a lot for them to be convinced otherwise. So let's take, for example, you got two guys, they both have the same PFF grade. It's both very good. One of them the NFL doesn't like. He's 5'10", 180 pounds, doesn't fit their profile at all. He goes undrafted, picked up by a team. The other guy is 6'1", runs a 4.3, fits all the measurable profiles. He's going to go in the first round. Those two guys could play exactly the same over the course of preseason. But the guy that's in the first round is going to have endless opportunities to screw up and be coached up and go back out there and try it again. The guy that's undrafted is going to get dramatically fewer reps and dramatically fewer opportunities to even be out there being looked at, and has a lot less rope to deal with. So, he screws up one or two times, he's gone. They're going to look for somebody else. And at corner in particular, it's a position where early on you screw up a lot. I mean, even Darrelle Revis, you go back to 2007, Revis' rookie year, there's a lot of bad in there. There were some bad plays. It was good as well, and we saw the guy that he could become. But let's say that Revis wasn't a first-round pick and he was this undrafted guy. There were plays in there that could have got him cut. And that's why I think it's going to be really difficult to evaluate corners going down, or to compare them, the NFL style of scouting versus the PFF style of scouting, and trying to work out, whether you were right or not on a player. Because a lot of the times, let's say, Gary Peters is one that a lot of people latch onto, but as we say, that was all Steve. So we can move past Gary
right.
for a bit.
So your wart is Troy Hill.
There you go, yeah. So Troy Hill is the guy that I think a lot of us liked. And Troy Hill graded really well last year for us. And more than one person put on tape and said, honestly, I'm not sure there's a corner that has better 2014 tape than Troy Hill in the entire draft class. And we knew at that point that Troy Hill was not a guy that was going to go high. We knew that not a lot of people were looking at this guy at all. And he ends up catching on. He ends up, I think the Bengals took him as an undrafted free agent. Yep. He got some time in the preseason, and he made some mistakes. And there were a few bad plays in there, and it was enough to get him cut. It was enough to get him dumped from a roster. But the thing is, I don't know if you can say from that limited experience that that's proof Troy Hill can't play at the NFL level. You could probably find pretty much any rookie. I mean, if you can find the number of times that Troy Hill screwed up. I can find you that number of bad plays from any rookie corner that played any kind of significant snaps this past season. Maybe Troy Hill's all just came at the one time. Maybe he didn't get the opportunity to show the positive, or maybe he did suck and we got it wrong, or he didn't, there was something about his profile that doesn't translate to the NFL level. But it's just very difficult to pinpoint exactly what part of that is the truth.
Well, let's pivot to something, because the conversation actually about Gary Peters reminded me a lot of this, and then your conversation about sucking in the preseason and then improving also reminded me of this. Trey Waynes is somebody that I've taken, I think, a couple of lumps for. He's someone that when you described Gary Peters, he actually came to mind. Because for me, that distinction was really important, that when they played physically, was it because they needed to overcome some sort of deficiency, or is it because they were a physical player, and if they weren't allowed to do that, they'd be able to adapt? And for me, Trey Waynes in college seemed like the kind of player who needed to hold, who needed to grab in order to overcome some other deficiencies, which is why I was so down on him. And then I felt kind of vindicated when that happened a ton in the preseason. And then not as much, of course, when during the regular season, in the limited time that he saw, he seemed to play pretty well. What were your impressions coming out of that draft of Trey Waynes, and sort of, since this is a Vikings podcast, what are your impressions maybe going forward of this guy?
Yeah, so for all the Gary Peters and the Troy Hills, I think we did pretty well on Trey Waynes, and we weren't wild on any of the top corners in last year's draft. We said that there may not be a true first round guy. There may not be a guy that we would give a first round grade to in abstract terms. Obviously, we knew some of these guys would go in the first round because it's just the way it goes. Right. But we said that Trey Waynes was a second round pick. This guy has too many problems with his game. The grade is not good. There's too much bad tape in there, and he's got potential. He's got blazing speed. He's got ability. There are big plays in there as well. But this is a guy that is raw enough that he shouldn't start from day one. He needs to sit for a year and figure out, be developed, learn how to play at the NFL level and see if he can get it. And, and I said, that makes it crazy for you to take him at number 11. I don't think that it's worth taking a guy that high who is probably going to have to sit year one and essentially almost write off that season. As it happened, the Vikings decided otherwise. They took him at 11. Whether they intended all along to sit him in the first year or whether that's just the way it worked out, it kind of vindicated what we all thought. But I do think that the guy has the potential. We saw the ability to play well. There's still some stuff about his game that's a little bit concerning. Anytime, the big red flag with him is that he had a slower short shuttle.
Right, he had a slower short shuttle than he had a 40, yeah.
Yeah, which is the list of corners that's the case for is like 7 guys long, and it's a who's who of, nobodies in the NFL. So that's a little concerning, and I think you can see.
And Xavier Rhodes. It's a list of who's and Xavier Rhodes.
Is he on that list as well? I didn't know that.
I think so. If not, it's certainly about equal. I remember, because when I was arguing, of course, about Trey Waynes, being so stiff, a lot of people were like, well, what about Xavier Rhodes? And to me, Xavier Rhodes is a much, different player in college, because I thought that he did a very good job of, not all the time, but did a very good job of finding ways to overcome his deficiency, in part because of his length, in part because of his, explosive capability, and in part because he didn't need to be physical. So let me take a look. Yeah, so his 20-yard shuttle at the pro day was 4.65, and his dash was 4.43. So yeah, he's on that list, but he's not on the combine list because he didn't run the shuttle at the combine. So
that's probably what it is. That makes sense. Yeah, I didn't know that. It's something that definitely showed up in Trey Waynes' tape, and that's a bit of a concern.
I think that's the difference, is that when the testing confirms what you suspect on the tape.
Yeah, there's definitely ways of mitigating almost all physical issues for a corner. Stuff like Richard Sherman's 40 time, or a guy who's changed a direction is not amazing. If you can get physical with a receiver, and it gets tricky because every time you put up a video clip of a corner in excellent coverage, somebody somewhere is going to complain about the contact and claim that that's a penalty. It really, people need to kind of understand what is allowed happen over the course of covering a route, and you're not allowed. Illegal contact is basically stuff that impedes the receiver from going straight through you, in cutting him off essentially in a way that you shouldn't be allowed to do. And pass interference is illegally preventing him getting to the ball before it arrives, essentially.
Right, you have a right to the space that you're in, but you don't have a right to the path of the receiver. Is that what you're trying to say?
Yeah, and you can make contact all the way through this. You just can't impede the guy from getting to the football.
Right.
But if you're just using the contact all the way through to essentially get a barometer on where that receiver is and what he's doing throughout his route, you can almost use him to guide you where he's going. You see Richard Sherman do it a lot, and Revis was a master.
Revis does that. Yeah.
You can use the contact to feel when he's going to break, and therefore be able to be ready for it and to break with him, as opposed to reacting to what he's doing. If you're trying to cover a guy without touching him, you're essentially relying on you seeing what he's doing, then processing it mentally, then reacting and going with him, and you're just delaying things. If you're actually feeling him do it, you cut out a giant swathe of time in between those things. You just go with them. And so when you see these guys, really high level guys, are able to tread that line between contact all the way through and use the contact to cover this guy, certainly in man coverage, and then stay just this side of too much contact. Revis was a master at his best of knowing where the line was in terms of what they would call and what they wouldn't. The Seahawks are a little bit different in that I think the Seahawks essentially know where the line is. Well, they know where the line is, and they work on the basis that if we go over that line a little bit every single snap, they can't call it.
Right, exactly.
Revis works on the basis that I know where the line is, I'm going to stay just the right side of it. Whereas I think they, as a team and as a defense, say, there's the line, we'll take one step over it, and we'll do it every single play and work on the basis that they can't call all of them.
Do you think a lot of people's perception that, hey, that's contact, therefore it's not an example of good coverage, do you think that perception just comes from how rapidly the NFL rules have changed? Not even just the rules, just the enforcement of those rules have changed, over the course of this last decade, and people now are just expecting any contact to be called?
I think instant replay generally has a lot to answer for. It all becomes super slow-mo, and what you're looking for is there any contact here at all, or is he early? Is it before the ball arrives? Right. And, you get this super slow-mo replay, and then the announcer goes, yep, there's the contact. Before the ball arrives, penalty. So now it's almost conditioned. It's hardwired into people to just look for contact, and if there's contact there, penalty, didn't count, wasn't good coverage. But the bottom line is you're allowed contact. You're allowed a huge amount of contact in coverage. You're just not allowed to do what they used to do, in terms of mugging receivers and tackling them off the line and all this kind of stuff. So you're allowed to make an awful lot of contact, and even in zone coverage and that kind of stuff, as long as you're not doing what they do in college, which is standing 10, 15 yards off the line and basically jamming him when he gets to you, you can still make contact with the guy and kind of disrupt his path and guide him around and all this kind of stuff. It's all a matter of understanding where the line is in terms of what contact you're allowed to make and using that to your advantage.
Okay, well, let's pivot the discussion away from cornerbacks real quick and just talk about the draft in general, and specifically sort of, what the Vikings need. Both Pro Football and Focus and I agree about the impact that Chad Greenway's re-signing should have on the Vikings' linebacker plans, which is none. They still need a linebacker. And I'm not so sure PFF is a huge fan of Emmanuel Lamur, taking that spot either, right? So the Vikings very probably need a linebacker. They very probably need a safety. They almost definitely need a wide receiver. The offensive line stuff is maybe not complicated to figure out, but it has become more complicated since all the signings. Given all of that, who are the prospects? Maybe name 5 that you think maybe are not necessarily the highest graded or the best prospects that you have, but are the best fits for what the Vikings attempt to do both offensively and defensively.
I would love to see Josh Dawson fall to the Vikings. I think he's the best fit. Pick. I think he's the best fit of all the receivers available. And depending on how, I think receiver is an interesting group in that I think they're ordered in very many different ways according to who is evaluating them. I think that's probably happening every year for receivers because it's a position that's so much down to what you do on offense and what best suits what you do, how you're going to order these guys. But this year it seems to be more than usual that the top few guys are all completely different types of receivers.
Right, yeah, I was about to say the top 4 receivers are all completely different. Like they all, if there's a 4-point spectrum, they'd all rest on completely different points of that spectrum. So that probably has to be part of the reason.
And therefore, trying to order them 1, 2, 3, 4, there's no definitive 1, 2, 3, 4. It's a case of offense A is going to have 1, 2, 3, 4. Offense B is going to be 4, 3, 2, 1. And neither of them are wrong. It's just this is what works best for that particular scheme. But I think Dawson is the best fit of all these guys for Minnesota's offense, for what they want a receiver to do, for what they don't have in the receiving core. And I think there's a decent chance, given how other people potentially have those receivers ordered, that he might actually end up there, which I think really would be their dream scenario. The other receivers I think are more interesting. Corey Coleman, I think, is my favorite receiver in the draft. I think in abstract terms, he's the best guy available, but I don't really like him for this scheme. I don't think he's a great fit for the Vikings, and I'd be kind of amazed if he was still around. So that probably works itself out.
Well, I'd be surprised if he made it past Houston right ahead of the Vikings, and even surprised if he made it to Houston. But real quick, so I kind of agree about Corey Coleman not being a fit, but I sometimes have a difficult time articulating why he wouldn't necessarily be a fit. What to you makes Corey Coleman, perhaps the most exciting receiver in the draft, not a great fit for what the Vikings do?
So it's an interesting receiver group because I don't think it's blessed with a huge amount of burst, quick twitch, acceleration, raw speed, and I think he's the guy that has all of those things. And he's kind of bigger than people gave him credit for. People were talking about this 5'10" guy. I think he measured.
A lot of people see that kind of quickness, and they see, like the Wes Walkers and the Percy Harvins, who are not 6 feet tall.
Yeah, and he's not a big receiver, but I don't think he's small either. I think he measured in just over 5'11" at the combine. He's got size to him, but he has this quickness and this burst that the other guys just don't have. And that Baylor system is a nightmare in terms of trying to evaluate receivers because they basically run 4 routes. They run wide receiver screens, they run slants, they run hitches, and they run goes, and nothing else. And not just, it's even worse than that because they don't just not run other routes. They don't even bother running routes.
They literally don't run, yeah.
Yeah, they don't even bother running routes if the ball isn't coming in their direction. Like, they literally just jog off the line and stand there. And the same thing's true.
Does that bother you and maybe not bothering you in terms of evaluation because they're coached to do that, and I totally understand why they sometimes have 100 plays a game, but I mean that bothers me when I'm watching just because it's so annoying to see this again and again and again, and I don't want it to impact my evaluation of the player. It's what he's told to do, but I mean that has to get frustrating for you, right?
I mean, it doesn't look good, but you just have to accept that this is the scheme. They want to be able to run up-tempo, no-huddle stuff, and they don't want those guys wrecked on plays that aren't going to them. If Corey Coleman has got to be on the field for this entire drive and they're going no-huddle, up-tempo, and he's got to run goes half the time, you don't want him to be tired after 4 of these in a row and have to cycle in number 4 receiver who might not be any good. You want to be able to keep Corey Coleman out there for the plays that Corey Coleman can be useful on. So it doesn't look good, but you really just have to say, look, this is a play he's not running on. Let's skip to the next one and move on. So it's a frustrating offense to deal with, but when you watch him play, he can eat up a cushion quicker than anyone else in this draft class. He just fires up on guys in their back pedal, and it gets them out of their back pedal really quickly, which is a big deal because he forces these guys to commit early to which direction they're going to try and cover him. And he has the kind of quickness and suddenness in his cuts to make them wrong. So a guy opens to the outside, he'll be able to head fake in that direction and cut back underneath him and suddenly have 5 yards of separation. And we did some advanced charting after the season, and we started charting things like separation, just raw separation. And Corey Coleman, I think, separated at the best rate of any receiver in this class. Was just almost always open in a way that the other guys just aren't. A guy like Treadwell, for example, is at the other end of the scale. He basically never separates. And not just this season, but 2014 as well. So I think Corey Coleman just has the ability to get open in a way most of these other guys don't. And I think that his speed and acceleration and burst and all those things we talked about, there just aren't that many guys in this draft with those. And you add that to the production that he had, which was ridiculous. It was obscene until they lost all of their quarterbacks and went down to basically the single wing offense by the end of the season. His numbers were just mind-bending.
Well, so you're doing a really poor job telling me why he's not a fit for that. I mean, that just sounds exciting to me. If I wanted a receiver in the Vikings offense, why wouldn't I want the guy that's separated better than anyone else in college?
No, it is. It's good. But I think the interesting thing about this Vikings offense is there's so many of these 7-step drops deep down the field things. I think they need a guy because Teddy Bridgewater's accuracy deep is not amazing. He can get the ball there, but it's not necessarily perfect placement. I think you're actually better having a guy that will go and win those contested catches. So a guy like Josh Dawson who will mitigate the accuracy of a quarterback, as opposed to the guy who will give him a bigger window to hit, but if he's off in that window, it's still not a great thing because that brings the defensive back into the equation and essentially makes it a contested catch again. I think you want the guy who, even if he's not that wide open to begin with, will make a better job of the ball when it arrives. And that's why I think you want Dawson over a guy like Corey Coleman, because there's so much of those deep ISO route type plays where you want the guy to just be there and be able to have Bridgewater able to throw it to him and essentially let him make the play.
So you brought up Treadwell, and I think that the narrative of Treadwell sort of before, so back in January, basically, was that he was also potentially this kind of guy. Maybe not Dawson, who had a greater catch radius, but that Treadwell was a big burly possession receiver, kind of like Brandon Marshall, but not 6'5". But he has kind of fallen out of favor, and not just because sort of his combine score, although that doesn't help. I mean, a lot of the analytics that a lot of people use, market share of yards, yards after a catch, the combine stuff, of course, they're not fans of him. And in general, it seems like, the film guys have cooled on him as well. What's the deal? I mean, he was supposed to be the best prospect according to like big draft media. And everyone kind of assumes he's a first round pick, but all people can say about him is stuff that trashes him essentially. So tell me about Treadwell, the prospect, why he deserves to be, in the first round. And if he doesn't deserve to be in the first round, why people thought he deserved to be in the first round.
I've honestly never really seen it with Treadwell. I've done a few Ole Miss games over the past couple of seasons, and every time I've gone into one of these games, I've expected to see this really, really dominant receiver. I haven't. It's just never been there. I've just seen a guy that was pretty good, made some plays, did well, but didn't separate himself from a dozen other receivers in college football that I've been doing, and not even ones that would be the top dozen receivers in the college landscape, just 12 guys you come across over the course of the games you're assigned. And the more you start looking into it, it just doesn't really add up. So everyone knows that the guy is not amazingly quick. He ran a 4.65, which I think basically just confirmed that, I'm not fast. Doesn't separate well. Like I said, was down at the bottom of our sort of separation rate statistics for both this season and the season before. So you're essentially saying, like I say, you get this big receiver, a possession guy, a Brandon Marshall type of receiver, but he isn't that size. He's not that big, and he's pretty good at contested catches, but not Josh Dawson good. And those aren't even the ones that concern me. The ones that concern me are the ones that he doesn't even try to make contested. So if your thing is going to be that you don't separate, but you're going to win the contested catches, you're going to go and get the ball over a defensive back regardless of position, you have to challenge for every single one of those. You have to attack the ball in the way that Odell Beckham or Brandon Marshall attacks the ball. You can't let it come to you. And way, way, way too many times Treadwell does exactly that. He lets the ball come to him, doesn't go and attack it, and essentially hopes that it arrives. And I think there's just too much of that in the guy's game. And this was back when people were talking about him as a top 10 player in the draft. And I was saying, I just don't see that. This guy looks like, a tail end of the first round type of player to me. And I think that's where you have to be careful with the all or nothing, black or white stuff we talked about before. and that my initial thought was everybody is way overrating this guy. But now I think people are in danger of almost dropping the guy too far and looking beyond what he does really well. And he does a lot of good things. You know, he gets open on slants. He can be a possession guy. He's pretty good after the catch. He's big, he's tough, he's strong with the ball. He blocks pretty well, though not amazingly, that some people want to give him credit for some ridiculous stuff. He does a weird thing actually in blocking that I don't think I've ever seen any other receiver do, which is he will block a guy, out in the perimeter, and the ball is, say, a run that's either a stretch play to the sideline or one that's bouncing out towards the sideline. He'll be blocking the corner one-on-one, and he'll have his eyes inside looking for somebody that he can peel back on as a second block. Huh. So he'll block this corner, and then he'll right the last second let go of the corner. Yeah, he'll let go of the corner and essentially crack block down on a linebacker or a safety and decleat them. So what it leads to is a bunch of these highlight decleating blocks.
Sounds like it looks fun. Wow. Okay.
It does. It looks spectacular, and you end up with these highlight reel decleating blocks. It makes everybody lose their mind and say this guy is the best blocking receiver in a decade. But in reality, there are plays that you or I could make if the guy doesn't see it coming. But the interesting thing is, I don't think I've ever seen anybody do that consistently, is actually look for that block. And in theory, when you think about it, it's a pretty smart block to make because the running back has a better shot beating the corner one-on-one with a relatively straight run at him than he does trying to shake a linebacker or a safety with an angle on him, chasing him towards the sideline. It's a pretty smart play. It's an interesting thing that I noticed from his tape.
Fair. That's... Okay, yeah. So I haven't watched any of Turtles, so that's interesting. When I look for it, that'll be fun to watch. Other positions for the Vikings. A lot of people talk about, linebackers. A lot of people talk about safeties. Vikings kind of weak at both. I don't think they got really any better at either position in the offseason, despite signing, 4 players at those positions. Who do you think fits best at those positions for the way Zimmer runs that defense? And it doesn't have to be in the first round, like people who you think could be steals in the middle of their rounds.
Carl Joseph is an interesting guy.
He had 4 games this season, right?
Yeah. He got injured, I think, in practice. He did something in practice and that ended the season. But he's got some really interesting tape. He's a really complete safety. I don't think many of these guys in this draft are. And there are some people that are crazy high on him. I've seen people say... I've seen people say that he's the best defensive back in the entire draft, which I think is bordering on insane, but gives you an indication of the kind of esteem he's held by some. And I think he's the only safety that has any chance, well, assuming you consider Jalen Ramsey a corner, the only safety that has any chance of going in that first round. And I don't think it's crazy for him to get as high as the Vikings. If they look at his tape and fall in love with what he could do next to Harrison
Carl Joseph
Smith,
is a first-round pick.
I think so, yeah.
Okay.
If you look at his tape and think about what he could do next to Harrison Smith, which is essentially be that the same kind of player. The Vikings being able to play 2 safeties, both of whom can play deep, both of whom can come down against the run, play in the box, do a little bit of matchup coverage. Both those guys, I think, could do all those things really well. And when you got 2 of them, I think Zimmer would love that in a defense. I think he would be an absolute... Yeah, I think he would be a perfect match for them. And, like I said, there's a lot of people that think very highly of him. I don't think his stock there, at least it's always difficult to gauge, but I don't think the consensus has him going that high, but I think he could get that high, especially if a team really falls in love with him. Linebacker's an interesting one. I don't think it's a weird class because you've got guys like Miles Jack, who's this athletic superstar that everybody loves. It's another one of those positions where I think, the PFF grading and what the NFL looks for are going to be slightly different. Last year, another one of the guys that we were really high on was Paul Dawson, who, went in the mid-round somewhere to the Bengals and has consequently been buried on their linebacker depth chart for reasons passing understanding, given what they're playing at the moment. But he was a guy
all the linebackers run a 4.9 40 now.
Yeah, exactly. He was a guy whose athletic measurables were terrible. Like almost a joke. If you looked at his mock draftable spider chart, it was just a dot in the middle of the graph. Like there was nothing. It was ridiculous. But his grading was just off the charts. He just found a way to the ball. You know the way Luke Kuechly has the ability to just weave his way through stuff and be at the football regardless of what happens on the play? Maybe he's not making the play, but he'll be in the pile by the end of it. Dawson had a similar thing if you just imagine Luke Kuechly being lot less athletic.
So in many ways, not Luke Kuechly.
Well, but if you think about it,
I know what you're trying to say.
A lot of what Kuechly does is not supreme athleticism. You know, that's what makes him the best linebacker in the NFL. But even if you took away the athleticism from Kuechly and just said,
He'd
right,
still be
all
a
you've got,
very good linebacker.
yeah,
right?
all you've got to go on is your instincts, your ability to sift through trash, all this kind of stuff. You still have a very good player. I think that's kind of the point we were trying to make with Paul Dawson is that, okay, the measurables thing sucks and that's not ideal. We wouldn't want that. But even in spite of all that, this guy finds the ball in a way these other guys don't. And there's got to be some value to that. And I think the guy in this draft that has a similar kind of profile is Scooby Wright.
From
Arizona.
You're going to get a lot of polarizing opinions on him.
Yeah. This past season he was injured and never really played a bit, played hurt the whole time. I would write off this past season entirely and look at the year before. And the year before, again, his grades were really, really good. I mean, he was almost as good as Paul Dawson's grades, admittedly on significantly more snaps, but his grade
are his tackle numbers maybe not accurate, but a good representation of how many tackles he actually gets?
I haven't looked at what his official numbers are, but he gets a lot of tackles.
Okay.
So if you look at this draft class a year ago, he had 25 more tackles and more solo tackles than anyone else in the class. Mm-hmm. He had like 25, 30, 40 more tackles than Miles Jack. You know, this is the kind of thing we're talking about. And those two actually played a very similar number of snaps. But he's a guy that has the same kind of deal. He ran like a 4.8 or something ridiculous. Again, really bad measurables. And he's compounded by the fact that I think he's got short arms as well. Again, if you were drawing up everything the NFL looks for in a linebacker, he doesn't tick any of the boxes. But his grade that season was really good. And he has the same kind of deal where his instincts are off the charts. He's got, an extra step in his head in terms of where other linebackers are. He's moving before the guy that's trying to block him. He's usually in the right space at the right time. And I suspect that's probably going to be productive at the next level. The question is, what does he not do well and what can you hide? What do you need to sort of scheme around? And I think his issue would be coverage. Anytime you got a guy that's running a 4.8, you don't want him running the seam with a receiver or anything like that. Mm-hmm. But I think the way the Vikings are set up, he can probably be the guy that comes off on third downs. He doesn't even need to be a 3-down guy. He can be a 2-down linebacker and be a pretty effective one.
Especially for the investment that it would take to get him. It's not a very high investment. It's like a 5th, 6th round pick. Yeah, according to CBS or whatever.
Yeah, although me and my rankings and CBS's rankings do not happily marry at times. I have a corner ranked 7th, I think, that is CBS's 82nd ranked corner.
Holy crap, I didn't know they even had 82. Okay.
I can't even picture in my head what a guy that is 82nd in the draft class should look like at corner.
So if the Vikings grabbed Scooby Wright, or, I think a lot of people kind of compare him to the Temple guy, Tyler Matakevich. If they grabbed him or Matakevich, do you suspect that they would be at middle linebacker and then they'd move Kendricks to the outside?
I think that would make sense. The other way of doing it would be to almost do what they used to do, which is sort of flip strong and weak side. They have one of those guys play strong side, but not actually be matching up with tight ends, essentially attacking the run and playing any kind of lead block that came along, which is one way of kind of flipping the the usual roles of strong and weak side linebackers, because they've got guys that can cover tight ends down the field. They don't need one of those guys to be doing it, but you do want one of those guys to be at the point of attack against the run.
Mm-hmm. No, fair enough. And are there any other safeties that, because you mentioned Carl Joseph, and I think the thing that's interesting about him, aside from the fact that there's always like intrigue about a guy who doesn't have a lot of film from this year, is that from the stuff that I've read about him, his coverage in the prior year he wasn't that good in coverage, or as good in coverage as he happened to be in those 4 games that he played this year. But he's always been really solid against the run. That kind of versatility in a safety is rare. A lot of the safeties in this draft class seem to be, except for Jalen Ramsey, seem to be like run stuffing box safeties. Are there other versatile safeties maybe later in the draft that you take time to develop?
Yeah, interestingly, we had him graded pretty well in coverage for both those years. It was the run game that took a big step on this year in terms of PFF grading.
That's so interesting. Okay.
But yeah, there's some interesting guys. A lot of this is sort of where you have some of these guys. Another interesting thing actually for linebacker is 2 of the safeties, or 2 of the guys that played safety in college, which is Sua Cravens from USC and Jeremy Cash from Duke. I think both those guys are linebackers in the NFL level and are both really intriguing because they kind of played linebacker anyway, but in a weird way that doesn't exist at the NFL level, which is they're not really in linebacker alignment. They're sort of lining up to the side of the line of scrimmage, but in the box. So if you imagine taking one of your outside linebackers and essentially moving him 5 to 8 yards laterally sideways and maybe a bit closer to the line of scrimmage. So you get to see these guys.
I was about to mention Shaq Thompson, but that's actually not what he was further back.
Yeah, so he played more as a sort of an actual safety / linebacker, whereas these guys are playing this weird hybrid role that doesn't really exist. So you get to see them play the run and you get to see them make all these impressive plays. What you don't really get to see them do is take NFL linebacker angles and deal with NFL blockers head up.
So I wanted to maybe switch gears and talk a little bit about a project that you would probably like to plug, the first annual PFF Draft Guide.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of work gone into this. We've got a whole bunch of data. You may or may not know that we were partners with the Senior Bowl this year, so we got to grade practice and to grade the one-on-ones and all this sort of stuff, and we have a lot of data on all the Senior Bowl guys there, one-on-one drills, quantified, all that kind of stuff. And all of that stuff, for a start, is in the draft guide. And that's, I think, almost certainly unique to us. It's basically the only place you're going to see this. We have draft profiles on the top 100-plus guys. We have rankings at each position. We've got a whole bunch of the signature stats, the kind of stuff that you used to see in PFF Premium. We've got the college versions of those for each position, some positional overview stuff, a lot of stuff in there. I don't know how many pages this thing is. Let me quickly scroll to the bottom of this. It is 264 pages worth of stuff. We've also got actually passing maps for all these guys, corners, so exactly where on the field these guys were targeted, where the quarterbacks were targeting, all this kind of stuff. There's a lot of data in this.
Yeah, wow, are there words too? Do you have summaries?
Yeah. Okay. No, so the data is attached to words. We describe the data and elaborate on the data in addition to throwing lots of it at you.
Fair enough. And then before we get into the mailbag, which I bet Dusty wants to get going to soon, just real quickly, your thoughts on the Vikings. I mean, Teddy specifically, obviously, but just in general, where the Vikings are going in the future, what you think of them as a team, Teddy is a golden god, that kind of stuff.
I think they're in a good place. This team has not been in great shape for a while, and a lot of that was trying to find a quarterback. I think Teddy Bridgewater is a viable quarterback. I think he can be a good quarterback. I like Mike Zimmer as a coach. I like the defense. I like almost all the time. I like most of the personnel decisions. I think they make some that are head scratchers and do not make a lot of sense. But overall, I think they make the majority of their decisions are good ones from a personnel standpoint. I don't like the offensive scheme. I think the offensive scheme is antiquated. It's buried in the past. You know, every offseason at PFF, we try and go back in time, and we did 2007. We're doing 2006 this offseason.
Oh, you're doing 2006? Oh, that's exciting.
Yeah, we're working on that now, a new tool. So it's testing processes and that kind of stuff. Endless fun and very bad tape quality. But you look at those games, 2006, 2007, that's where this offense belongs. This offense does not belong in 2015, 2016. It's just, it doesn't fit. The Vikings lead the league in these 7-step drops. The number of receivers that actually go into patterns is among the lowest in the league. It's basically just designing an offense that makes it as hard as humanly possible on the quarterback and on the offensive line, which are the two things that are hardest to get right in terms of, offense functionality. Everyone else in the league, almost to a team, works with quicker passing, quicker, at least changing it up. And the teams that don't, the teams that do run this more vertical style thing, have something else about the system to make it function. So you take Carolina. Okay. Well, you've got Carolina, you've got Cam Newton there. There's a running dimension that opens that up. There's what Cam Newton can do as a threat. You get Arizona, they run far more 3 wide receiver sets. So they're running deep, and they have this deep targeting offense. And in a lot of ways, it's a similar offense to Minnesota's, but there are more passing options. They don't put it all on the quarterback to find one of 2 guys that are downfield running patterns. They give Carson Palmer more places to go with the ball. So, and there really aren't that many teams other than those 2 that have a really expansive. I mean, we saw what happened to the Colts this year when they kind of steadfastly stuck to the deep passing thing, and it just destroyed Andrew Luck, essentially, and they wouldn't change it. It was only when Matt Hasselbeck came in and physically could not run that offense that they had to essentially modernize the thing, and it actually looked more viable.
Well, that was fun and exciting and optimistic, Sam. Thank you.
Look, everything else is good. I just don't like the offense.
Just everything else. I mean, everything. I mean, not the offense, but everything else.
Just the scheme.
No, I mean we share the same gripes. So I'm just getting on you.
I like the players, just not the guy pulling the switches.
No, that's
pulling the switches
bothers me a lot. But it's also interesting because, I mean, going into the year, it seemed like the Vikings would be the kind of team that would want to expand the number of receivers they had on the field. At the end of the year, it certainly did not seem like that, given how much the receivers sucked. But with Mike Wallace and someone they were hyping, Charles Johnson and Jarius Wright, who, for the role that he plays, I think is pretty excellent. And then, rookie Stephon Diggs, who at the time we thought would play a Jarius Wright role early on and then maybe test himself on the outside. It seemed like they would give themselves opportunity to get 3 receiver sets out there. They chose not to do that, and by reducing the number of passing options, because Adrian Peterson is not a passing option, and half the time the tight end needed to chip or stay in to help TJ Clemmings. Teddy was often choosing between 2 receivers. So this is something we definitely agree on. But
yeah, and you're hanging those guys out onto dry on the offensive line. If it's all 7-step drops. They're not the best offensive line in the world, but they're made to look a lot worse by the fact that every single time they're dropping back to pass protect, they know it's going to be for a long time, deep in the pocket. It's the hardest possible assignment. There's no bubble screens. Give the guys something easy to do once in a while.
Yeah, no kidding. If there was a story that came out a day or 2 ago about how Pat Shurmur's ideas for an offense, which I'm not even sure what they are anymore, given that he spent so much time in Philadelphia, but was the passing game coordinator, but sort of, and Tony Sparano's ideas for an offense, if their ideas do get incorporated in a North Chargers playbook, and then he calls concepts that are formulated out of those ideas. That's a 2-part process that needs to happen, both of which are kind of up in the air. If that happens, what's kind of the step you see the offense taking? And I assume that those kind of concepts would be, shorter passing games and such.
I think they have to be. I mean, there's no way you kind of say and happily incorporate stuff like that unless you're admitting that what's going on at the moment is not ideal. And the only logical outcome of all that to me is you dial back on the 7-step drop stuff. You start increasing some of the passing speed. You start making some of these shorter, easier passes that we're all talking about. So in theory, they start adding all those things and mixing that into the offense. There's no reason it can't succeed. It's not like the concepts are, entirely archaic. It's not like they don't function at the NFL level. It's just not this offense wholesale. You kind of see it. Norv Turner, when he has a quarterback that he doesn't feel can run the system 100%, I think the system is a lot more effective. When he feels that he has to help his quarterback out, the offense actually looks a lot more modern and effective and sophisticated. It's only when he feels that this quarterback is finally capable of running the thing without any training wheels that he gives them the full package, and suddenly you get launched back into 2006 and you see this kind of backdated offense. It's a weird system. I think he's actually a smart coach and capable of doing it. I just think his kind of dream scenario of what an offense looks like today is off.
So this is what I thought happened at the end of Teddy's rookie year. This is what I think Darren Page also thought he saw at the end of Teddy's rookie years, that a lot of the offensive concepts in the final 5 or 6 games of the season were much closer to modern. Do you know if that's the case?
I haven't actually looked into it in that much detail, but
Sure.
that sounds right. That certainly seems plausible.
Fair enough. I think we can go right to the mailbag. Is that right, Dusty?
Yeah,
Dusty?
there's not a whole lot to talk about, really. I mean, you guys answered the big burning question in line, which is when do we draft Josh Dawson, and why is it always first? So, having already analyzed that, there are a couple of questions about people not named Josh Dawson, although regrettably most of them are about wide receiver options. Tim Clark 65 _DN at Timo Clark on Twitter writes us, offensive tackle or wide receiver at number 23. And the second part of this question I think is more interesting. Who's the best offensive tackle that Sam thinks will be available at 23?
Yeah, that is interesting. I think there's 3 top tackles. You've got Laramie Tunsil from Ole Miss. You've got Jack Conklin from Michigan State, and Ronnie Stanley from Notre Dame.
It's not Taylor Decker, then.
I don't think so. I think he's further down that list. I don't think he's necessarily a bad player. And Ben actually today drew up a playlist of his sort of tough pass protection assignments. So 5 and 7 step drops.
So a hater's guide is what he drew up.
Well, just a kind of 5 and 7 step, the sort of stuff we've been talking about. If you put him in this Minnesota Vikings offense, what does he look like? And he actually apparently looked very good. So he might be moving up our big board.
Okay.
As we go into the next iteration. But for the moment, we have him below Conklin and Stanley. And Conklin and Stanley, I mean, Tunsil will be long gone, but Conklin and Stanley are the 2 interesting guys because we are probably higher on Conklin than anybody else. Because, again, his grading is just obscene. He just crushed people, especially in the run game.
I've seen a lot of people very skeptical of Conklin.
Yeah, and for as ugly as some of his technique and pass protection stuff is, it hasn't actually caused him any problems. Even against people that have kind of tried to beat him for speed, he's more or less been able to cope with it fine. You'll be able to find plays here and there where it looks terrible and it's bad. But overall, he's played pretty well.
Is it unorthodox? Because I know that like Howard Mudd coached offensive lines often looked unorthodox, and I know Sebastian Vollmer sometimes does some weird stuff too, and it works out for him really, really well. But he's super athletic, so I don't know if that counts. Is it unorthodox stuff?
There's some unorthodox stuff in there, but there's some stuff that I think is just a lack of NFL-style passing sets and NFL-style way of pass protection. He'll need to develop some stuff, but I think the idea that he's bad at pass protection, I think, is not accurate. I think he can be fine, and he's so good.
What was his pass blocking efficiency?
I haven't actually looked at the pass blocking efficiency, but he gave up 12 total pressures last season. Which is pretty damn
It's
good.
pretty nice. Yeah.
Sorry, that's 2014. Let's see what he is in 2015.
Well, he must be shit.
Oh, it's
This
even better,
year, then.
2015.
Jeez.
No, it's the same, in fact.
Oh.
It is, in fact, it's 12 again.
12. Okay.
So there you go,
Good job.
consistency. 2 years.
And
some
then the
pretty
other guy,
dominating-
Ronnie Stanley.
Stanley's interesting because he's the other way in that he's, I think, very good in pass protection, but his run blocking is not anywhere near as good as it looks like it should be. You know, he looks so much smoother and so much more technically sound on tape, but he's just not dominating people the way Conklin does. And earlier in the process, it was Tunsil and Stanley. And now I think people are starting to sour a little bit on Stanley. It's difficult to know.
A lot of people have been souring on him. Some of it is like attitudinal. They think that he plays a little bit too passive. Some of it is that, that they think that the things that he's good at or great at, that he's only good at them, and so he doesn't deserve to be as high as he is. Honestly, when people describe him, he sounds a lot like Matt Khalil, which isn't. I think that's too big of a warning flag. I think that draws too many bad comparisons because there are Matt Khalil style tackles that have done well, but that's the impression that I get when people describe him.
Yeah, and it's difficult to know if he's actually dropping or if people are just disliking the measurable numbers that he put up, and sort of draft Twitter, if you like, is souring on him as opposed to the actual NFL souring on him. Mm-hmm. So he's a guy that could potentially be available when the Vikings pick, as is Conklin. If everyone else is lower on him than we are, we have him going to Buffalo at the moment in our mock drafts, and have in every single mock draft so far, just because it's such a ridiculously perfect fit. But he's a guy that could easily be around when the Vikings pick if the rest of the NFL is lower on him than we are. And if that happens, I think that would be a great pick for them.
All right, so I'm going to take 2 email questions and combine them into one question with 2 words.
Mash them together.
Nate Schetzel and Logan Reed write basically 2 different versions of the question. Laquan Treadwell?
Nice. I like it.
Yeah, well,
yeah. I mean,
we did a pretty good job of answering this, but the question really speaks to do you think that his pro day should have a bearing on how you would evaluate him?
No, I don't think his pro day should change anything. I mean, essentially, his pro day was just about how long he could stall the number 4.65 coming out to everybody.
Right.
If you didn't know that that's what the number was going to look like just from watching him play, I can't help you. I mean, it was pretty obvious that this is not a fast guy. That's not his game. He's probably going to run something relatively slow. So the entire exercise, not running at the combine, it was just a case of how long can we stop this number being out there. But it shouldn't really change anything. You should know this is what he does. And the question you have to ask yourself is, how valuable is what he does? And can he be a Brandon Marshall or an Anquan Bolden type of receiver? Or is this inability to separate going to really hold him back?
What if he had run like a 4.52? Basically, what does Brian run? What if he had run a 4.52? Would that have shocked you? Would that have surprised you? Would you have gone back and looked for stuff?
I mean, if he'd run a 4.5 flat, it would have been on the lower end of what it would have been quicker than I would have expected. It wouldn't have, I don't think. See, the thing is, when you're talking about 40 times where the difference between 4.5 and 4.65 is 1500ths of a second, which is like the margin of error for clicking a stopwatch. Okay, a lot of this stuff is electronically timed, but we're talking about really small margins a lot of the time. The kind of stuff
it's a game of inches, Sam. Game of inches.
It is, but in certain ranges, I don't think that makes a difference. I'm not sure that the difference between 4.5 flat and 4.65 actually changes anything. The difference between 4.2 and 4.35 makes a difference. That's a significant difference, because that takes you from really fast to there's no one else around that's that fast. The difference between 4.5 and 4.65 is this is a guy that we can comfortably keep up with, to this is a guy who we have to work at it a little bit what we can keep up with. I mean, what's it changing? So yeah, if he'd run something in the 4.4s, that would have made me think about it a bit more. Just that extra bit of difference. The 4.4s, the 4.4s would have made me go, okay, that's weird. That didn't look like the case. But I don't think there's much of a difference between 4.5 and 4.6.
Nathan writes in with one more question, which I would actually be curious to get both of your opinions about. I am thinking about joining Twitter. How many hot takes do I need to make? How many hot takes do I need to make, or fire? I believe is the appropriate terminology to change my avatar away from the egg.
For me, I think that you probably have to at someone who is definitely going to respond to you back. So, Benjamin Albright for sure.
So not just anyone, but somebody with like over 10,000 followers, like an
opportunity someone with over 10,000 followers, but also someone
up.
who's going to respond.
Okay.
So I think Albright is the ideal for that. Sam actually probably is going to respond. The other Irish guy, I don't even know how to pronounce his name. Cian, is that it? Do you know Sam?
There you go. Yeah, you can do it. Steve can't do it. Steve can't pronounce his name.
Steve can't. I mean, there's not a ton of ways to pronounce it. Anyway.
Steve's found two so far that aren't the right way.
With Sean and Cian, is that where that is too?
Steve went with Cian and KN, I think, are the two he's been with.
Well, I'm sure that pleased him. Cian will probably just block you, so you can't do that. But yeah, and if you find maybe actually you, Sam, you respond to a lot of people.
I think the move is to keep the egg and just personalize it.
I like that one.
Stick a mustache and a hat on it.
Yeah, the fake mustache egg. I'm a huge fan of that.
Yeah,
turning the egg upside down. Stuff like that.
A hat and a monocle.
I think upside down egg is too subtle. So many people read on mobile. You can skip past that without potentially seeing that you have a soul behind the keys and you're not just.
I never thought I'd hear someone living in Denver, Colorado, calling something too subtle.
I don't know what that's supposed to mean.
Well, there's actually one more question here from Nathan that I want to get your answer on, Sam. It's kind of interesting. It's difficult to word, but a lot of talk about best player available. Knowing that the best player available might be like a kicker and accounting for like positional importance in general. Who are the top 5 best players available that you think? Not specific to the Vikings need, but just in general, best players available that will be at 23.
Oh man, that's tough. It's so difficult to know how these drafts are going to fall because everything kind of hinges on the things before it, and it's only when you start kind of doing your own mock drafts that you realize how the dominoes can fall and guys that you abstractly considered as top 5 or top 10 pick can actually end up tumbling just depending on a few different picks. Not necessarily because teams are drafting for need, but just because of the way it works out. In absolute best case scenarios, it's the guys we've been talking about. It's Dawson, it's one of the tackles, whether it's Stanley or Conklin. I think there's a real chance that a guy like Carl Joseph would earn that spot. I think it's maybe that would be a surprise to a lot of people, but I think he can play well enough to justify that pick. Who else could? I think there's not just Dawson, but another one of the two of the wide receivers, Michael Thomas from Ohio State, is
that's
potentially
my guy.
a really interesting pick. Yeah, I think he could be a really interesting pick for Minnesota there. So there's a few of those guys. If the board falls right, could be very good. It's also it's a ridiculously good draft in terms of interior defensive players. So it's definitely
Do you think the
not a
Vikings
need.
need to take a shot somewhere at those defensive interior players at some point in the draft, given how deep it is?
I don't think they necessarily need to, but I think they'd be smart to because, as you said, it's just so ridiculously deep. And I wouldn't even be against doing it in the first round if the board fell in the right way and you got somebody sitting there that you just said, look, this guy's too good to pass up. It's not a position of need for them, but the best teams don't let that dissuade them from taking a ridiculously good player who's sitting there available in their draft spot.
Well, who are your top 2 interior defensive players then?
Well, the top one is DeForest Buckner, who, if he isn't gone in the top 5, then something is dramatically wrong. Sheldon Rankins would be a ridiculously good player to fall. Chris Jones from Mississippi State would be.
Yeah, I was wondering. So he's got this. He was a 3rd round guy, and now he's like a 2nd round guy. I've seen only very little of him, but what I've seen has been pretty stellar. You think he's a 1st round guy too?
Yeah, I think he's definitely a first round guy and a top one. The guy we have that is beyond in love with him is Mike Renner. And we did this exercise. Mike Renner got the defensive interior guys to do the tape study on when we first started doing it. And at the end of all this stuff, we would watch some tape and we would do this little exercise where we would say to everyone in the room, where would you take this guy in the draft? In abstract terms, put a number on where you would draft him. What draft spot would you take him at the highest? And, people had him in at 20, at 15, at, 25, whatever. And it gets to Mike Renner, and Mike Renner says, number 3.
Woo.
So Mike Renner absolutely loves Chris Jones, and a lot of us are coming around to what he's seeing. The more you watch of him, and certainly the later on the season, the better he looks. And he looks a lot at times like kind of early career Kevin Williams, which, I'm sure everyone remembers is a hell of a player.
Yeah, 9 sacks one of those years. And then if the Vikings were going to, because I do think at some point they want to address the depth questions at defensive tackle. I'm not so sure they're confident in Shamar. Tom Johnson's kind of old. But that sounds like a mid to late round consideration. I don't know where players like Kenny Clark will fall. I don't know where some of these nose tackles are going to fall. I mean, there's a lot of players that can play one technique nose tackle in this class, it seems like. Who are the kind of guys that you suspect will be available in the mid rounds that you think will be sort of the best bet for the Vikings to grab as sort of like a depth guy?
It's so hard to know where some of these guys are projected. A guy like Sheldon Day, his stock seems to be all over the place. I've seen people projecting him in the mid round somewhere, and I think if he's available anywhere in the mid rounds, he's an absolute steal. He suffers from.
So he was a defensive end at one point and then kicked inside, right?
Yeah, and he's kind of moved around a lot. He's an undersized guy that I think has played a bit of both and can play a bit of both. I think he probably projects as a 3-tech at the next level, especially if you don't need him to play early and you can kind of, bulk him up from the bench a little bit. But I don't think he needs to put on much, if anything. The guy's 285 pounds maybe, which is basically Aaron Donald size.
Well, I mean, Zimmer's had some pretty light 3-techs, so that's not a bad.
And he's a little taller than Aaron Donald, so it's not quite a like-for-like deal, but he's that kind of penetrating interior 3-tech player. And his thing, he doesn't finish the play all the time. He spends a lot of time on the ground, which I know some people hate and think is a cardinal sin. But he's disrupting so many plays that, you'll more than live with it. And his production last season in grading terms was crazy. I think he was the second highest graded defensive interior player after only Buckner. So you're going to take some plays where he's lying on the ground and not finishing the play and accept that, in the grand scheme of things, the net win you get out of him is huge.
Okay, and then are there any nose tackles that... Because, a lot of people, they don't know what to do with, people who could be 3-4 DEs or nose tackles. People like Dron Reed, Ashawn Robinson, I mentioned Kenny Clark. Andrew Billings is pretty one-dimensional, but very good at that one dimension, according to a lot of people. But sort of in the mid-rounds, are there any nose tackles that you think could provide depth for the Vikings?
Yeah, the nose tackle one is interesting. I think there's more of these guys that are I think there's a lot of penetrating 3-tech type players later in the draft. I don't know how many of the guys that are
like Willie Henry, Malik Collins. Those are the kind of guys that are like 3-techs.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of those guys around. It's a weird draft. I don't know how many true kind of nose tackle type players that are more run specialists. Like you said, Jaron Reed is the true throwback in this draft. He's the 2-gap guy that he's a strange player in that I think he could do that from either end or nose tackle, which you don't see too much of. You don't see too many guys that could play 2-gapping 3-4 end and 3-4 nose tackle at the same time and be able to do it both pretty well. But I think he's one of those guys. It's a weird draft for that, but I think there's some of these guys later on that actually make more sense. Pretty much everybody now is running these 1-gap things. It's difficult to find guys that have that run special or that run capability and be able to play sort of on that nose without just being penetrators. There aren't that many of them, I don't think.
Yeah, fair enough. So I distracted us from the mailbag a lot and ended up taking a little bit more of your time. Dusty, is there anything else we need to take care of?
Well, one more question. Actually, two more questions from official question asker Tommy the Gun 13 on Twitter.
Oh, all right.
One, if the Vikings sign Andre Johnson, does that lower the need for drafting a wide receiver this year? And two, how does Sam deal with the constant hate he receives from NFL coaches, who will not be named here?
Well, answer the first question first, and let's talk about the coach thing second.
Yeah, the Andre Johnson thing is easy. It shouldn't change a thing at all. The coach thing is interesting because I think we're up to 22 NFL teams at this point. So 2/3 of the NFL pays for PFF, but
they largely pay for the alignment data, correct?
It differs team to team.
Okay.
It's the level to which teams integrate the stuff depends on the team. Some teams take a lot of the alignment data, the advanced data that we do, the grading. A lot of them use the grading heavily because we can link it up to their video system. So
right.
They don't necessarily need to trust it, but they can use it as a starting point to essentially cut through all the work that they used to have QC coaches doing on a Monday morning. So instead of saying to a QC coach, go through this guy's last 4 games and find all the plays where he did this well, that's going to take that guy most of Monday. Instead, we can give him a playlist of exactly what he's asking for, and then that guy can spend 20 minutes going through that playlist and chopping out the 1 or 2 plays that maybe they disagree with or are different or whatever. Right. But basically saves him a huge amount of work and effort. So 22 teams, 2/3 of the NFL are paying for the data in some way, shape, or form, and most of them are using it pretty heavily. But what coaches dislike is that they go into a press conference and they get bombarded by questions about players that are playing not well or playing, and they don't want to deal with that. Right. And in the past, they've been able to say, what do you guys know? You're wrong. Right. This guy's playing well. I say so. But now these guys all come in armed with PFF data and PFF grading and say, PFF says, at which point you either say, yeah, you're right, the guy's playing like crap, my bad, which is very unlikely to happen, or you've got to fire back with something,
Right.
And
right.
I think that's just what you're hearing a lot of the time is these guys they just have to say something to get rid of the question. And, it ends up being to dismiss the source.
So not that you can tell us whether or not the Vikings purchased Pro Football Focus data, though if they did, that would be beyond hilarious. But do you think that when the coach who's not going to be named in this question, do you think that when he blasts PFF, you don't know the assignment, etc., do you think that he's maybe overstating the case? I mean, because when it came to Matt Khalil in particular, the Vikings, I mean, it was just a season-long backpedal, like, it's just the preseason. Oh, he's playing better than you think. Oh, there's some things we have to work on. Oh, we don't know what the problem is. Oh, maybe it's confidence. Oh, wow, he's playing really badly. That was like the thing over the course of the season. Do you think it was a way to insulate from criticism, or do you think that there's a lot of they have no idea what they're talking about, like genuinely?
No, I think a lot of it is just to try and insulate from criticism, to try and deflect attention, to try and dismiss the question. It's a case of, I don't want to answer your question. I don't want to tell you why player X is playing really badly, because I don't want to admit that player X is playing really badly, because that's not a good discussion for us to have to get in at this point. We want to get things on the right track. We want to get everybody playing well. We want to address the problems inside. And if it is a confidence thing for any of these guys, we don't want to be trashing the guy openly in the media. So I think most of this stuff is just guys trying to get rid of the question.
Okay, well, I know that there's not a ton of time for you left, but I've got 2 questions I still want to ask that are related to this. The first is it more a mark of pride when your name gets brought up in these presses, or does it bother you because you know what kind of response it's going to be? That's my first. Because one of the beat writers here, Chris Thomason from the Pioneer Press, he's kind of known among the beat writer circles for PFF says, Matt Khalil is playing poorly. When he could have just said Matt Khalil is playing poorly, and you don't really need to qualify it. Does it bother you? Is it like a mark of pride?
It's interesting. With he who shall not be named in this sequence of questions. mentions this, it's a kind of a case, it comes up, and some the reaction tends to be, what's he said now? What do we have to deal with on Twitter now for the next few hours? But it kind of depends what the comment is. It's always interesting when NFL coaches or high people mention PFF, but depending on what they've said, it may or may not be a fun few hours.
Fair enough. The second question I have is just in general, like how much does that maybe not impede you, but how much has that sort of changed your process, and how have things changed in terms of like bringing NFL coaches on board, talking to NFL teams a lot about this sort of thing, and sort of the level of knowledge that you think is necessary for you to make confident conclusions about the players that you're watching, especially at a bunch of different positions?
Yeah, I don't think it's changed much in terms of the level of knowledge that we've had to get to make the stuff accurate. What it's done is it's given us an understanding of the barriers you need to break down to access all these organizations. And generally speaking, as we've been doing this over the last couple of years, it's not a case of you find a team, you get discussions with the team, and they say, "No, you know what? This is bad data. We're not interested in." It's a case of just working your way up the organization and convincing the analytics guy, then convincing the QC guys, then convincing the personnel guys, then the coaches, and working your way through the entire organization and getting everybody to sign off before eventually the deal gets done. And generally speaking, every one of these people that you get to sit down in front of, present the data, show them what it is, show them what we can do for them. Initially, certainly there are some people more conservative than others, and when you explain to them how the system works, etc., there are some people that are not that interested unless you can either show them the data, or if you don't have that kind of time, you need some kind of NFL cachet. You need some kind of credibility shortcut. So,
Gunther Cunningham actually really enjoys, the stuff.
Yeah, so if we can get guys to endorse us along the line, if we can hire guys that have NFL coaching experience, and we have a partnership now with a group called PCN, which is the Pro Coaches Network, which is a group of a lot of former and current NFL coaches that have something like 400 years of combined coaching experience, and they audit the PFF grades and give us feedback and all this kind of stuff. So when we can start attaching all that kind of stuff to the discussions, it just bypasses the kind of crap that you need to wade through to eventually convince these guys. So I think it's just a case of getting a kind of an inbuilt credibility leg up, what you get to get to these guys and to get them to understand what it is and how it can be beneficial then without having them just dismiss it out of hand.
And on the media side of that, do you think that, so one common criticism, do you think that Pro Football Focus grades in general have, quote unquote, replaced analysis, that people are, that it's actually moved the level of discussion sideways or down by allowing people to quote a number instead of talking about the context of a play? I know that's, on the website itself, when you do analysis, there's a lot of talk about context, but in terms of the way that people use Pro Football Focus data, that's a common criticism levied, maybe not at you, but at the way that the whole thing has sort of evolved and moved forward.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think the level of football analysis and discussion generally has improved dramatically over the past 5-10 years, whatever number you want to put on. Right. I think we're in a much better place now than we were some time ago. I don't think that necessarily, I don't think that all that was PFF, but I think PFF has probably had a part of it. But I think there's a certain type of person that is inherently lazy in what they do in terms of their analysis, in terms of their content, in terms of their production. And those people are going to go for the easiest and quickest route to whatever it is they want to do. And if PFF isn't around, those people are going to look at, the easiest numbers to hand. They're going to talk to you about starts, yards, sacks, yards, interceptions, and you're going to get nothing from them. If Fair PFF enough. Is around, those people are just going to go to PFF grade, PFF ranking. There's no way you're going to get intelligent debate out of those guys. It's just not what they do. And, from dealing with some reporters over the years. Most of these guys are great, but some guys, you have to spoon feed them. You have to, like, you can give them. I mean, I've had guys where they've had access to the premium stats, and then you'll get like a weekly email asking for something that's in the premium stats, and you're like, look, here's the link to where it is. I'm not going to copy you out the data every week. But that's, some people you just can't help. Those are the guys that are probably holding the debate back. I don't think BFF being around or not is going to make a difference to that.
Sure. Well, I've taken enough of your time. You live in Ireland and therefore need to probably go to bed. We really appreciate you being on the show. Dusty, you have anything to add?
Not really. Sam, do you have anything that you would like to plug beyond?
No, the draft guide is good. If you're interested in PFF's draft guide, the first one we've ever done, head over to Pro Football Focus. You should be able to buy it there when it's by the time you're listening to this.
Oh, wow! So extremely soon then. All right,
that's quick. Even despite the lack of our producer James Pogachnik, who is currently watching the Minnesota Wild lose to the San Jose Sharks 1-0 with a few minutes left in the first period.
Oh, that's his mistake.
Will still have the show up double quick for you. But yeah, we realize it is nearly 2 a.m. in Ireland. So Sam Monson, thank you so much for being on the show. You are, of course, welcome back anytime.
Anytime, guys. Thanks for having me.
That was phenomenal. I enjoyed that very much.
That was great. Great. That was good stuff, Sam. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks, guys.
All right, see you around.
Take it easy. See ya.
All right. And
I thought that was a great show. All right.
Oh, yeah. I will do the outro in 3, 2, 1. So that was Sam Monson. You can find him at PFF_Sam on Twitter, or, of course, his writing at ProFootballFocus.com. Our erstwhile producer, James, is at Big Mono on the Twitter. Arif, of course, at Arifus on NFL. And little old me at Dusty O'Connell. You can follow the show on Twitter at NorseCodeDN. Catch all the updates and be cued to send in mailbag questions once a week by that account. You can also email us anytime at norsecodepodcast@gmail.com. Check us out on Facebook, facebook.com/Daily Norseman. Go to dailynorseman.com to find the complete archive of Norse Code episodes, or on iTunes or wherever fine podcasts are aggregated. If you believe that this show is worth a couple of your dollars and would like to contribute them to the cause of getting Arif more draft guides, including the first annual Pro Football Focus draft guide, then please make a one-time donation at our PayPal link, paypal.me/NorseCode, or become a recurring donor, which is actually super awesome for us for a variety of reasons. Go to patreon.com/NorseCode and contribute any amount that you desire. We suggest $3.50. You can skip one latte a month at Starbucks. You don't need that Tivana Oprah chai. I mean, maybe you do, but you could probably do with one less. Give that money to us instead. Either one of those.
I mean, we're a step away from fat shaming our listeners, Dusty.
No, the chai itself doesn't really have it's not like super fattening. It's, I guess, if you got it with like breve instead of skim milk or water, then perhaps. But I would never dare to do such a thing to our intrepid listenership. Norse Code will return approximately this time next week. We look forward to seeing you then. And until then, our formula is and shall remain: keep Teddy alive.